The terrace lights were exactly the shade of gold Odessa had asked for 3 times before the vendor got it right. 6 weeks of planning had led to this. Ivory orchids flown in from 3 states away, a string quartet rehearsed until the tempo matched his favorite song, napkins stitched with a small gold W by a seamstress Odessa had tracked down through a friend of a friend. She stood alone on the terrace of the Calder estate, straightening the last centerpiece, and let herself feel something rare, not nervousness, but certainty. 22 years of marriage had taught her that love sometimes needed proof, not just feeling. Tonight was hers to give. I would choose you again, she thought, every time. She had no idea that sentence was about to be tested in front of 200 people. Welcome, whether this is your first time here or your 50th. If family, loyalty, and what people become when love and legacy collide mean something to you, subscribe now, because tonight the Calder family is about to learn who they really are. By 10 o'clock, the doors at the far end of that terrace would open, and a woman in red would walk in like she belonged there. She did, but to understand why, we have to go back, before the orchids, before the quartet, before Odessa ever believed a marriage could be undone by a signature nobody bothered to finish. We have to go back to the man whose name was stitched into every napkin in gold. Weston Calder liked to tell the story a certain way, and over the years, the story had hardened into legend. A single textile mill. A man who wore the same navy suit to every meeting because he couldn't yet afford a second one. A fortune built brick by brick until Calder Holdings stretched across manufacturing, real estate, and a boutique hotel chain that carried the family name in gold lettering on 3 continents. Magazines loved the story. Investors loved it more. It was the kind of self-made myth that made people trust a man before they'd read a single page of his contracts. Odessa had believed it before anyone else did. She had met Weston when the company was still modest enough to run out of a single rented office, when belief was the only currency either of them had. She had watched him turn that belief into something real, and for 22 years she had considered it the truest chapter of her life. Their children had grown up inside that same story, though it shaped each of them differently. Briar Calder, 31, had spent 8 years climbing through Calder Holdings on merit alone, refusing every door that opened simply because of her last name. She wanted her father's trust, not his charity. Proof that she could carry what he'd built without diminishing it. She studied every deal he closed. She stayed later than anyone in the building except him. And still, every time she asked him directly whether the company would one day be hers, he answered with a smile meant for investors he wasn't ready to commit to. Her younger brother Dash wanted none of it. He had grown up watching his father miss recitals for board meetings, and somewhere in his 20s, he'd quietly decided that inheriting the empire meant inheriting its absences too. He worked now in restoration architecture, rebuilding old structures rather than expanding new ones, and visited the family estate only when his mother asked twice. Odessa loved both of them fiercely, in the specific way a mother loves children who want opposite things from the same inheritance. But her devotion to Weston himself was something else entirely, steady, deliberate, chosen again every year rather than simply maintained. She was not a woman who mistook love for blindness. She had watched Weston's flaws for 2 decades and stayed anyway, believing the shape of the life they'd built together was worth more than the cracks in it. She had no way of knowing, straightening centerpieces 6 weeks before his 50th birthday, that one of those cracks ran 23 years deep, all the way back to a version of Weston Calder she had never been shown. 3 weeks before the party, Odessa hired a photographer recommended by her event planner, a quiet, watchful young man named Cal Duvall, who arrived early to every walkthrough and asked more questions than most photographers bothered to. He wanted to know where Weston had grown up, whether the family had always summered at the coast, whether there were old photo albums he could study. For continuity, he explained, so the new photos feel like they belong to the same story. Odessa found him a little unusual, but harmless, even endearing, in the way of someone who took his work seriously. She handed him a box of old photographs without a second thought. Weston as a young man standing in front of the original mill, a handful of yellowed images from a life before hers that she had never paid much attention to. Cal studied those photographs far longer than the assignment called for. He had grown up 900 miles from the Calder estate, raised by a mother who spoke of his father only in fragments, a name mentioned once during a hospital. Stay, a jawline he apparently shared with a man in a magazine article his mother kept folded in her nightstand for reasons she never explained until she was dying. Weston called her, she'd finally told him, her hand cold in his. Find him if you need to. Don't if you don't. Cal had needed to. He simply hadn't decided how. Photography had gotten him close. A job at the party would get him closer. He told himself he wasn't planning to say anything at all, that he only wanted to stand in the same room as his father once and see for himself what kind of man had let a marriage and a son disappear so completely from the version of his life the magazines printed. If you've ever carried a question for years without knowing what you'd do the day you finally got an answer, you already understand Cal better than anyone at that party did. Stay close. What happens next changes everything for every person on that terrace, and you won't want to miss it. Make sure you're subscribed before we get there. Briar's relationship with Elias Winters had started the way most inconvenient love stories do, professionally, over a contract dispute between Calder Holdings and the boutique architecture firm he consulted for. He was clever in meetings in a way that made her sit up straighter, and honest in a way. That made her trust him faster than she trusted most people who worked anywhere near her father's money. It was Elias who first said, months before the party, the thing Briar had been too loyal to say to herself. Your father talks about legacy like it's a title he's handing you, he told her one evening. Over dinner she'd been too tired to finish. But a title isn't the same as trust. Has he ever actually said the company is yours? Or does he just let you assume it, the way he lets everyone assume things? Briar hadn't liked the question. She liked it less for how long it stayed with her afterward, resurfacing in board meetings, in late nights reviewing numbers that would never be legally hers until someone said so out loud. So she went to her father directly, weeks before his birthday, and asked him plainly whether the succession plan the board kept postponing would finally name her as his replacement when he stepped back from day-to-day operations. Weston had smiled, the smile he gave investors he wasn't ready to commit to. Let's not talk business at your mother's party, he'd said. Let her have her night. It was a kind sentence wearing the shape of an answer. Briar recognized the difference, even as she nodded and let the conversation close. That night, she told Elias what her father had said, expecting comfort. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment, then said the thing that stayed with her longer than anything else that week. A man who loved you would have just answered the question. He didn't say it to wound her. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, because he believed she deserved plainness more than she deserved protection. And it was that steadiness, that refusal to let her settle for charm in place of clarity, that made something in Briar finally harden into resolve. By the time she dressed for her father's party, she had made a private decision, one she hadn't spoken aloud to anyone, not even Elias. Whatever happened tonight, she would not let another year pass on vague promises and practiced smiles. She would ask again, properly, formally, with witnesses if necessary, and this time she would not accept a sentence that only sounded like an answer. She had no idea how soon and how completely the ground beneath that decision was about to shift. If you've ever loved someone who kept mistaking your patience for permission, you already know exactly how Briar felt walking through those terrace doors that night. Stay with us. Her resolve is about to collide with something far bigger than a promotion. The terrace glowed gold by the time the first guests arrived. Business partners in tailored suits, old friends from before the money, cousins who appeared only for milestones worth photographing. Odessa stood near the entrance, greeting each arrival with the practiced warmth of a woman who had learned, over 2 decades, exactly how to host a room without ever seeming to try. Weston arrived at 8, blindfolded, led onto the terrace by Dash's steady hand. When the lights came up and 200 voices shouted his name at once, his surprise was, for once, completely unguarded. No performance in it, no polish. Odessa watched his face and felt something settle warmly in her chest. This, she thought, this is why I did all of it. Dash's toast came first, short and warm, the kind of gently teasing story that made his father laugh until his eyes watered, the sort of memory that had nothing to do with boardrooms and everything to do with being someone's son. The room laughed with him, and for a moment, the distance Dash usually kept from his father's world disappeared entirely. Briar's toast came next, warmer than she'd planned, more careful than she felt. She ended it with a line she'd rehearsed 3 times in the mirror that morning, something about hoping to carry his work forward, the way he taught us to. She watched her father's face as she said it, searching for some flicker of confirmation, He smiled at her, the way he smiled at everyone that night. Nothing more. Cal Duvall moved along the edges of the room with his camera, capturing all of it. The toasts, the embraces, Odessa's hand resting on Weston's shoulder, as though she could hold the moment in place by touch alone. He photographed Breyer's toast longest, though no one noticed him lingering. He photographed Weston's laughter, the ease of a man who believed his story was finally, safely his own to tell. By 9:30 the band had shifted into something slower, and Odessa allowed herself, for the first time in 6 weeks, to simply stand still and watch the party she'd built happen around her. 22 years, she thought, and I would choose every one of them again. It was nearly 10 o'clock when the music dipped low between songs and the doors at the far end of the terrace opened. If you've ever felt a room change temperature before you understood why, don't go anywhere, because that's exactly what happened next, and none of them saw it coming. A woman in red stood at the far doors, scanning the room until she found Weston's face across the crowd. She was perhaps 60, elegant in the unhurried way of someone who had never needed to rush to be noticed. She did not smile so much as arrive at an expression of quiet, devastating satisfaction. "Happy birthday, Weston," she said, her voice carrying further than a normal speaking voice should. "It's been a long time since I've been invited to one of these." The music didn't stop right away, but the conversations nearest the doors did, spreading outward through the crowd until the whole terrace had gone still. Odessa felt Weston's hand tighten around his champagne glass. She had never seen that particular stillness on his face before. Not fear exactly, but the look of a man watching a door he'd bricked over decades ago swing open without warning. "Serafina," he said, just her name, nothing else. She crossed the terrace slowly, with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment far longer than anyone else in the room could imagine. When she stopped in front of Odessa, there was something almost like sympathy in her eyes. "I'm sorry to do this here," she said, reaching into her clutch for a folded document, soft at the creases from years of handling. "But I think, after 23 years, I've earned the right to stop being patient in private." Odessa took the paper. Some instinct told her that refusing it wouldn't make it less true. It was a marriage certificate. Weston Calder and Serafina Duvall, dated 11 years before Odessa had ever met him. Beneath it, a second document, far more damaging than the first, a court filing showing that the divorce Weston had always referenced vaguely as finalized long before you and I met had never actually been completed. A filing fee unpaid, a signature missing, a separation treated, for over 2 decades, as a formality no one had bothered to finish, which meant, on paper, in the eyes of the law, Weston Calder had never stopped being married to the woman standing on his terrace in red, which meant Odessa's own marriage, the one she had built her entire adult life inside of, had no legal foundation at all. The silence that followed wasn't loud or theatrical. It was worse than that. It was the silence of 200 people realizing in real time that they were watching something true. "You told me it was finalized," Odessa said quietly, not to the crowd, only to him. "You told me there was nothing left to sign." "There wasn't supposed to be," Weston said, and even as the words left him, he seemed to hear how insufficient they were. "It was decades ago, Odessa. I thought—" "You thought it would just disappear," Serafina finished for him, without unkindness, almost gently. "The way you thought I would. The way you thought our son would." Odessa's eyes moved from Serafina's face to the word she'd just used, son. She hadn't asked yet what that meant. She wouldn't have to wait long. 23 years, Odessa said, mostly to herself, testing the number the way someone tests a bruise to see how deep it goes. She looked at the certificate in her hands, at the gold napkins on every table around her, at the life she had spent 6 weeks and 22 years assembling with careful, deliberate hands. "I'm not here to take anything from you," Serafina said to her, and for the first time, her voice lost some of its rehearsed calm. "I came because I'm 62 years old, and I refuse to spend one more year being the truth someone else decided wasn't worth mentioning." Weston stepped forward, reaching for something, an explanation, an apology, some sentence that might undo the last 90 seconds. "Odessa, please, let me—" "Don't," she said, and it wasn't loud, but it stopped him completely. "Not yet. Not until I understand what I'm even standing inside of. If you've ever discovered that a piece of your life wasn't yours to trust the way you thought it was, You already know the particular kind of quiet that fell over that terrace. This story is only getting started. Stay with us for what comes next. Serafina turned from Odessa and scanned the crowd until her eyes landed near the drink table, where a young man stood with his camera lowered, his face pale in a way that had nothing to do with the lighting. "You've been very thorough tonight," she said to him, not unkindly. Every head on the terrace turned. "Mom," Cal said quietly, one word, landing in the silence like a confession, because until that moment, nobody on the terrace, including Weston, had known the photographer documenting the party was anyone other than a stranger hired for the evening. Weston's expression shifted from confusion to something closer to recognition, the specific shock of seeing, in a grown man's jaw and the set of his shoulders, features he recognized from his own reflection 20 years younger. "You're," he started, and couldn't finish the sentence. "Cal," the young man said. "Cal Duval. I've been trying to figure out for 6 years whether I wanted to meet you." He glanced at his mother, something raw crossing his face. "I told myself tonight I'd just take the pictures and leave." "I didn't come for you," Serafina said to him, gentler now. "I came because I'm done being the inconvenient truth in another woman's beautiful life. Your father owes both of us more honesty than a folded piece of paper in a drawer." Briar, standing near her mother, felt the floor of her entire identity tilt beneath her. A brother, an older half-brother, older than her, born before her parents had even met, which meant the story she'd been told her whole life, the story of a man who built everything from nothing before meeting the love of his life, had a missing chapter. A wife, a child, an entire abandoned beginning her father had simply chosen not to mention. She looked toward Elias, standing a few feet away, and found on his face not shock but something steadier, the quiet readiness of a man who had told her months ago that she deserved the truth from her father, and had simply been waiting for the moment it finally arrived. If tonight has taught this family anything so far, it's that some truths don't ask permission before they walk through the front door. We're not finished yet. The hardest choice of the night still hasn't been made. Stay close for what Odessa does next. There is a kind of grief that has nothing to do with death, the grief of discovering that a life you built with your whole heart stood on ground you were never shown clearly. Odessa felt it settle into her chest as she stood on the terrace she had decorated with her own hands, surrounded by 200 guests who didn't know where to look. She could have wept. Some quieter version of herself, 20 years younger, might have. Instead, she set down her champagne glass, walked to the small stage where the band had gone silent, and picked up the microphone Weston had used earlier to thank his guests for coming. "I think," she said, and her voice did not shake nearly as much as she expected it to, "that this has turned into a more honest party than I planned, so let's finish it honestly." She looked at Weston. "I built 22 years of my life around a story you told me. I don't know yet what I do with the parts of it that weren't true, but I know this. Whatever happens to our marriage, on paper or otherwise, I am not going to be the woman who pretends tonight didn't happen so the party can go back to normal." She turned to Serafina. "You deserved better than a drawer. So does he." Her eyes moved to Cal, and something in her voice softened. "So does your son." The room stayed silent, but it was a different silence now. Not shock, but something closer to respect, the kind that gathers around a person choosing composure over collapse in real time. "I spent 6 weeks planning this party because I wanted to prove that 22 years of love could still be chosen," Odessa continued. "I still believe that. I just didn't know, until tonight, that choosing honestly might mean choosing myself first." She set the microphone down gently, the way she'd set down every centerpiece that afternoon, and for the first time all evening, let herself simply stop performing the night. Weston didn't move toward her. Some instinct, finally, told him not to. In the weeks that followed, the Calder family didn't collapse so much as reassemble itself, slowly and painfully, into something more honest than it had been before. Weston's legal marriage to Odessa was quietly corrected once the decades-old filing was properly completed, a technical fix that did nothing to repair what had cracked between them. Odessa didn't leave the estate right away, but she stopped attending board functions on his arm, stopped hosting the dinners that had once defined her role in the company's public image. Instead, she began appearing at Calder Holdings in her own right, not as Weston's wife, but as a shareholder who had quietly held stock in the company since its early years, back when believing in him had been the only investment she could afford. Briar, with Elias steady beside her, not pushing, only present, finally forced a conversation with her father she'd circled for months. She didn't ask for the company out of guilt. She asked for it to be earned, formally, on terms no dinner table smile could quietly revise. Weston, humbled in a way 20 years of success had never managed, agreed. Cal didn't ask for money, and he didn't want the empire his father had built without him. What he wanted, he told Weston plainly during one difficult conversation in the study weeks later, was simply to stop being a secret. Weston gave him that, publicly, without hedging, for the first time in his life. Dash, who had spent years keeping his distance from the company his father built, found himself unexpectedly drawn to his newly discovered older brother. They had nothing to do with Calder Holdings between them, which somehow made it easier to become family, a closeness built on nothing the company had given either of them, and nothing it could take away. If you've ever watched a family fall apart only to find each other again on more honest terms, you already know this kind of ending doesn't erase the damage, it just makes room for something truer, to grow. Before we close this one out, if this story moved you, subscribe and stay for the next, because the Calder family isn't the last family this channel will ask you to understand. The empire survived. It always does. Buildings and balance sheets rarely feel the same things people do. But the family that built it did not survive in the same shape. It became something smaller in certain ways and far more honest in others. A family that had learned, at enormous cost, that a legacy built on unfinished truths eventually finds its way into the light, usually on the night it can do the most damage. Weston spent the years that followed learning something he had never once needed to learn during 3 decades of building an empire, that being loved and being known are not the same thing, and that he had spent most of his life accepting the first while quietly avoiding the second. He rebuilt what he could, slowly and imperfectly. His relationship with Cal came back changed, but real. So did his standing with Briar. The marriage he had once believed was simply his to keep did not come back at all. He would say, years later, to anyone who asked what he'd learned, that a man can spend his whole life building something meant to last and still lose the one thing he never thought to protect, the trust of the people who believed his story before the world did. Odessa never regretted the party. Not the orchids, not the monogram napkins, not the 6 weeks of careful planning that had, in the end, revealed far more than she'd intended it to. She had wanted that night to prove that 22 years of love could still be chosen. She simply hadn't known that choosing honestly would mean choosing herself first. She kept her seat at the boardroom table. She kept her name. She did not keep the version of her marriage she had spent 2 decades believing in, but she walked away from that terrace with something she hadn't had in years, a life that was fully, finally, hers to tell the truth about. "I would choose you again," she had told herself that morning. By the end of the night, she understood the sentence differently. She had chosen herself instead, and for the first time in 22 years, that choice was enough.